Adventist History CarTalks with Pastor Kevin Morgan.
So when I make pronouncements about the past in reconstructing a story, that someone who is critical of Ellen White may come to a different conclusion, it's because they did so with some presupposition and some evidence. Let me give you an example. In the case of Steve Daly, we discussed a certain part of history that he had come to a conclusion, and you could see he was agitated because I questioned his conclusion. But I was taking our audience to the details that I came to a different conclusion. And you can see the cognitive dissonance as I was presenting that. He said he thought it was ridiculous. But the point was about where did Ellen White get her first vision. Casebolt will say it came from William Miller, and others will say it came from William Foy, because he gave visions. And Steve Daly will say that Ellen White got it from Joseph Turner because she had a conversation with him, and mentions in describing that conversation that he had a paper that was at their house, but she had not read it. And he says, poppycock, she must have read it, or else how would she have had the same view? Well, the paper that was at the house happens to be material that he had written prior to their conversation. And in their conversation, he presented what was a new view that none of the other believers in Portland had ever considered. In fact, they had dismissed the view about the midnight cry. And that's why Ellen White's vision is called the midnight cry, because that was the overlapping point in her vision. So he assumed, Steve Daly assumed, that it was the paper that she had at her house that she read. But further evidence shows that it was this new view that Joseph Turner presented, that he wrote up in a special publication that now still exists, and that others would cite as describing this view about the midnight cry and its significance. They would not hark back to the earlier paper that was at the house, and therefore he made the assumption that the paper that she was talking about was the one that included this view, and that she's just lying about having read it. But it doesn't stand up to the evidence. And after I had the discussion with him, I was able to find further corroboration for Joseph Turner's steps, so that I was able to document who he talked to after he talked to Ellen, after he talked to S.N. Snow and others, Brown, and published it in this new paper, and the progress where he was. So it all fits together tightly in the reconstruction as I continued to piece it together from further evidence of discussions in those early papers about where he was and who he spoke to and who was influenced by him, and when William Miller received information from him on the same view. So it all fits together once you have all of those pieces. But if you take fewer pieces to put something together, you're going to get a skewed view of history, and your interpretation will not be correct. And so in this instance, because Steve Daly has not looked at the full evidence, his conclusion is faulty. Now, so why would I consider that my reconstruction is superior to his? Because it includes more pieces. Now, is it possible that there could be some small adjusting of even my view? Certainly. If we unearth more information, that same view will come into sharper focus in some other way. But his view totally disregards all of the evidence that I was able to include, and therefore it is not a full enough picture. If you think of history as combining pieces of a puzzle, you don't have the proper view of that history until you have all the pieces together. Now, you may be able to when you're putting a puzzle together, you may not have every piece in place before you start to see a picture emerging. But until you get all the pieces, you don't have the full picture. And unfortunately, history is not just already carefully cut pieces that can only fit in one way, because you're making sense out of fragments of history, pieces of evidence. And so it's more like Legos that you can put together in more than one way. There may be one intended object that you're supposed to make out of the Legos, but you can put them together in different ways based on your bias, based on your willingness to look at all the pieces and how that they should fit. Another example, Donald McAdams, who recently reported his work again in a video on YouTube that I watched. And he repeated with good memory what he had concluded back in 74 and 77 in his papers on Huss and the writing of Ellen White about Huss for great controversy in the 1888 edition. Without going into the full of that one, there was one point where he and I had an email discussion about Huss's whereabouts in 1411, because his reading of the evidence said that when there was interdict pronounced in Bohemia, the king intervened, and therefore there was no necessity of Huss's leaving for his hometown of Hassanitz. And so he said, if she says that he left and the historical evidence says that he didn't leave, then how can she be right? How can you take that as being right? Well, unfortunately, in this case, Dr. McAdams did not have all of the evidence. And so he was making a judgment based on an author who only mentioned Huss's departure in 1410 and his departure in 1412, 2 departures. But I discovered in a translation of Huss's work, and then was able to track it back to his original statement in the Czech language, that he described 3 departures, and the events that he describes puts them in 1410, 1412, and also in 1411. 3 departures. So even though McAdams was correct that the king intervened and was able to control the effects of that interdict, still the evidence points to the fact that out of deference, Huss left the capital of Prague and went to Husinec on his own. And I had some friends who are Czech, and they were able to read the old language for me. It's kind of an older form of Czech, but enough to confirm that the translation that I had in the other English edition was correct. So that's a key point in whether she's correct or not. The evidence that was lacking for him in his research points to a departure in 1411, just as Ellen White wrote. So she's not wrong. And his view, though, is still trapped in the past to the conclusion that he had drawn at that time. And I understand how a person's thinking is somewhat cemented by their own research. But and at the time that I discussed this with him, I didn't have the full evidence, and therefore it wasn't persuasive to Dr. McAdams that he should go back and reconsider. But now, having studied it through, not only from various historians, and the most current historian is named Fudge, Ron Grable and I were able to reconstruct the departures and to see that Ellen White was right. So this is an ongoing matter. I'm not seeking to vindicate myself, but just to point out how that later historians can come back and see the cracks that were skipped and the materials that needed to be filled in to come to different conclusions in judging the past. In my view, on these salient points that I have described here, Ellen White is vindicated. And I don't know why she would get it right when Wiley who was her intermediate source of that history, was not exactly correct in how he reported what took place at that interdict in 1411. And we all must humbly present our conclusions about history, because there is always the possibility that a future historian with greater detail will come to a more accurate conclusion. It is always possible that later historians who discard information will certainly come to different conclusions, but that does not mean it's more of an accurate one. I am currently slated to do some research on Casebolt's material, and whereas I have not read much of it yet, I discovered that there are some flaws that I have discussed with other historians that he was advised about, but he came to some conclusions that did not seem warranted. And in that case, this is a PS. He describes an account of a woman or a young lady who was in a Millerite meeting before 1844, and he described the young lady as describing a trance-like vision or dream, and he said, this must have been Ellen. And superficially, it might seem that was who he was describing, because she did have dreams before she had a vision. And yet, if you analyze the description of the eyewitness, he refers to her as a pretty young lady, and that might be poetically correct if you accept it at face value that, well, maybe he's just kind of glossing. But Ellen White would not have been described as a pretty young lady. And later on, when he was describing her, he reiterates that she was a pretty young lady, and that does not seem to fit Ellen at all. And maybe it's the assumption that how many young women would be having visions in Portland or having emphatic dreams in Portland besides Ellen. Well, that's an assumption. But the particulars of the story does not back up his view. Now, that doesn't discount the bulk of his research. It doesn't address any other particular. But it's just on that one point that I believe he's been mistaken in it. Another issue was about Bates' view of her visions. And he takes some of the evidence to say that James White was describing Bates when he quotes a letter that was skeptical of Ellen White, that he couldn't accept, and that he wrote off as just her vivid imagination playing into her dreams and something like that. But when you look very carefully at Joseph Bates' description of his acceptance of her gift, which came to its height when she described her passing by planets and going into the opening heavens, he does not say that he saw her in vision prior to that. He does not say he saw it and then dismissed it. It does not; those things don't add up. And this was what one historian told me, that he tried to tell Casebolt that's not true. That identification is not likely at all to be Bates. So this is what historians do, and we can critique earlier work by later work, and it helps us to have a more accurate view. And that's what we want, is a more accurate view. Not necessarily to be right, although it's embarrassing to admit when you've been wrong. I have done any number of come to conclusions on too small of evidence, and then later had to retract it. And those who have received my emails as I was making discoveries will know that. I thought I had found the house where Ellen White had her first vision based on a misunderstanding of a description of where the house was. And I thought it was on the corner of two streets, but what it said was that it was near that street. And as I continued to dig into it and look at the deeds and who owned it and so on, I discovered that it was further on down the street. And the house that I had hoped that was going to be the house, that is a beautiful house that still exists, is not the house. And I had to eat crow with my peers in making that announcement prematurely. And I've done that on other occasions as well, getting too excited about finding some information. So yes, we can all make mistakes, and we should all approach our work with humility, either to be humble or to be humiliated later by someone else. Signing off.